Good afternoon. My name is John Stafford. I'm a candidate for state representative in the 37th Legislative District. My opponent is the incumbent, Sharon Tomiko Santos. I'm a 20-year resident of the district. I live on Beacon Hill. Before that, I lived in Columbia City. And this video is designed, as I've suggested, to talk about my top 4 priorities for the upcoming legislative session. I, of course, have views on many issues, and you can see the details on my website. This will just cover the first 4. So my first policy priority is to protect the most vulnerable during this crisis. As I've suggested elsewhere, there are 4 crises right now. There's the health crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, by which I mean that it's the lower income minority communities that are being most impacted by the health and economic crisis, and there's a budget crisis that's going to occur in Olympia. So protecting the most vulnerable at this time is my first priority. And this will have many manifestations. There needs to be free health care, mental health care support for lower income communities. There needs to be unemployment benefits that are extended, property tax relief that will help lower income individuals financially, food security, rent relief, utility payment relief, prohibitions against evictions, etc. There needs to be additional homeless shelters and low-income housing. And also there's a civil rights dimension that needs to be protected. Individuals need to be protected against the risk of deportation, and undocumented residents need to be able to qualify to receive benefits. So all of these things are significant. They're going to require funding, and they amalgamate to be my first priority for the upcoming legislative session. And I'll make one side comment here. There have been some calls for things like universal basic income or universal rent cancellations. And I just want to say that, in my view, now is the exact wrong time to be implementing those policies. We don't want to be giving rent relief and income to people who are affluent. We don't have the resources. So the merits of those policies can be debated later, but for now, the scarce resources that we have need to be focused on our lower income communities. Second, and related, we need desperately a new source of progressive taxation in Washington state. Our poorest citizens, residents, pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than any other state in the country. We are 50th in the nation in the regressivity of our tax structure. That's appalling, that's shameful. We've known about this for a long time and haven't done anything about it. The reason for this, of course, is that we, unlike virtually every state, don't have an income tax or a capital gains tax. So we need some form of progressive taxation. Could be income tax, capital gains, a wealth tax, a financial transactions tax. I'm reasonably flexible on which specific tax or mix of taxes is implemented, but that's critical to addressing this crisis and, candidly, the future of the state in a more general sense. Third, we need to restructure how the state manages its operations. So we can't make incremental adjustments. We have to rethink the way the state handles the functions and services that it provides. For example, K-12 education. Should we move to a blended model where maybe half the students come one day, half the students another, to minimize density and health risks at the school and make up for that with some online learning? That's a possibility. Our hospitals are losing money because people with non-COVID-19 health risks aren't going to the hospitals out of fear of contracting COVID-19. So hospitals are in trouble. That suggests a different payment mechanism for hospitals, and this is an opportunity, in my view, to start transitioning towards a single-payer healthcare program where the payments come from the state and they can be calibrated to make sure hospitals remain viable and also become more efficient, so we can save some money and do things in a way that matches the challenges of our time. The same thing with mental health. The state has started to embark on a transition from central facilities to community mental health facilities. That needs to accelerate at this time. And even things like urban design. We need to maintain high levels of urban density to deal with the threat of climate change, but density is risky at the time of the pandemic. So we need to think these things through carefully and make sure we're restructuring the way the state operates to meet the challenges of these times. Again, this isn't a time for incremental reform, it's a time for restructuring. Okay, so that's the third, and then the fourth is climate change. Climate change, right now we're looking at the catastrophic consequences of not taking science seriously with the COVID pandemic. And we're going to learn the same lesson at 10 times this level of severity with climate change if we don't take the science of that seriously. So we can't afford to leave climate on the sidelines while we deal with this. We need to deal with it now. But what that does mean is we need to find ways to address climate change that are very low cost, because we don't want to divert resources from the pandemic crisis response and the economy crisis response. So we need to pass legislation that's low cost and high impact. And there's a number of such things, and I've listed a few here. The Clean Fuels Program, which calls for a lower carbon content in the fuels that we're burning, in particular in the transportation section. An act called the HEAL Act, which explores and takes action against the reality that climate change also disproportionately impacts lower income and minority communities, so that needs to be taken into account. There's a bill that I strongly support to ban in 2030 and from there on out the purchase of new internal combustion engine vehicles. I also believe it's critical to introduce mandatory climate change education, K-12, so that our youth are learning about the importance of acknowledging science and learning what it says about climate change. And finally, declaring a climate emergency in Washington State. All of those can be done at very, very, very little cost, and all of those will have very significant impacts on climate. So climate remains an emergency and it needs to be dealt with. So those are my priorities. Taking care of the most vulnerable as the first priority, progressive taxation, restructuring the state, and continuing to deal with climate change in a much more aggressive manner. Again, my name is John Stafford. I'm a candidate for state representative in the 37th Legislative District. Thank you very much for taking the time to learn more about my candidacy. I do ask for your support, and I look forward to being in touch as the campaign continues.